We're going to start this podcast episode with a quiz. I want you to evaluate the integral of 3x squared plus 5 being multiplied by e to the x cubed plus 5x, and that's all divided by 2 plus e dx. Now, of course, if anyone went back and, rewound the episode or wrote the problem down, I'm sure they got the answer. A couple of you may have even been able to get the answer just by hearing it. But most of us, despite this being a relatively simple substitution integral, most of us would not be able to solve that integral just by hearing it. And that's kind of the point of this episode, is that spoken math and spoken most things really doesn't work for most people. If you just are only hearing math, you're not going to be able to visualize it. You're not going to be able to see it. You're not going to be able to internalize it. You're not going to be able to retain it. And so what we need to be doing as math instructors is increasing the level of multimodality that we bring into the classroom, both for ourselves and as our student. And I think a lot of us have been there. We've told the students what to do. We're frustrated that they don't understand. They weren't listening, it feels a lot of times. But really what's happening a lot of times is that when you speak, like, there's some things that we can retain, but first off, nobody can listen all the time. No matter how much you're trying, nobody can listen all the time. And then, people have a lot of different brains, a lot of different processing, a lot of things that are going on. And then it's just hard to process some things by listening. And so the idea for this episode first came from a keynote speaker from the AMATIC National Conference a couple years back that really drove this home from an equity standpoint for multilingual learners. But it really affects all of us, whether English is our first language or not. And so this is something that is very important. And again, hopefully this can help you in a sense that it's going to reduce the number of times that students ask us to repeat ourselves. And we can do this by writing more things down is really kind of the short of this, is writing more things down, speaking and writing, as well as showing all of these multiple methods that we'll get into in the future section that will help students be able to hear and retain the information we're sharing with them, which will make both parties happier. Then, of course, math makes all of this extra difficult. This is true in every classroom, but math makes this much more difficult, right? We have more complicated symbols. There's verbal ambiguity. Oh, is that all in parentheses? Was that some of it in parentheses? What's under the fraction bar, right? We have notation. We have different processes. There's a lot to visualize. And so many times when a student's asking me a homework problem, I need to write it down. I can't listen to this, and I have so much experience with it. So very similarly, we need to be writing things down when students ask us questions so they can see what we're saying. And again, formatting really works. So if you're using some kind of written communication or some kind of email and you're not able to format your math equations, that's going to make things a lot harder as well. And this does all tie into Universal Design for Learning, UDL. Many of us hear this all the time, UDL, UDL, UDL. But, and I'm not going to talk too much about UDL as a framework, but just as a brief reminder of what UDL means, is it's essentially three main things that students should have multiple means of engagement. So, giving them choices, giving them different tasks, and allowing some room for student autonomy. There should be multiple means of representation, and that's really the main focus of this episode, that we should be presenting information in different formats, vocally, text, audio, visible, or video, hands-on demonstrations. And then the last part of UDL is multiple means of action and expression, which we touch on also in this episode, allowing students to express their learning in a variety of ways. And I think that's the hardest for me as a professor. And so we'll talk about that. I think that can be very intimidating, but also very rewarding when we can do it well and when we have the time and bandwidth for it. So now that that introduction is out of the way, let's go on to the first section where we talk about how we should communicate as instructors. And this again goes for communicating math and communicating non-math. So, a lot of times we ask our students to do something or we give them instructions. If we only give verbal instructions, that's going to be a big friction point. It will cause a lot of frustration on both sides. So when we're talking about math and non-math, we should be using a lot of different modes. Now, a lot of times this is speaking, as I'm doing right now. This is not a multimodal podcast. There is a video podcast, but I intend for this to be listening only, so that you don't miss anything by listening. But we should also be writing things down. And I know we all do this. We all write and we all speak in our classrooms, but I think we could really write more down. If we're saying something, if we can show it on the board in some capacity, it's going to make things a lot easier. Instructions are good. If we're saying things about an equation and not writing them down, taking a moment to write them down in a different color off to the side can be very helpful. Our gestures are a way of communicating things as well. The classic example of this is when you think about end behavior of polynomials, and people will raise both hands like a field goal, or do them to either side like they're doing a dance, and stuff like that. But those gestures, that's communication, right? Our body language is communication. How we do our recordings, if we're recording videos, all of our graphs and diagrams, right? Math lends itself very naturally to a different way of communicating functions. We have the algebraic with the formulas. We have the graphical representations. We have other descriptions of functions as well. And then just also, I think we need to be incorporating more sounds in our classroom as well. Desmos, for example, has an audio trace feature that's really good for unsighted people. And that's very cool. And I think that's something that we can kind of all incorporate into our graphs. In a calculus class, when we're talking about increasing and decreasing functions, we can show that by modifying our pitch. And that's just another way of experiencing the same idea, which gives students another way of learning and experiencing that same idea as well. So those are some of the ways that we can communicate in different modalities: speaking, writing, gesturing, recording, diagrams and graphs, sounds. And that's just kind of to get us started. Another added thing to talk about when we talk about writing things down is we should also be very, very careful what we erase. And of course, you're going to have to erase things on the whiteboard if you have mistakes, or if you run out of space, you're going to have to erase things on the whiteboard or chalkboard or whatever visual medium you have. But I think we as math instructors, we have a tendency to show our math the same way that we do our math ourselves. Of oh yeah, this can cancel, I can erase this, or oh, this reduces to this, let me just change it on the board, or I think that's almost as big of a culprit as erasing things, is just changing things on the board. But then we show that process in time, but that process is no longer visible to students. And invariably we get the question, if anyone is bold enough to ask a question at all, we get the question of, wait, where did that come from? And it's not that they weren't listening, probably, maybe it was. It's not necessarily that they don't understand, but when we remove one of those steps, that again, we might just do naturally when we're solving a problem ourselves, when we remove that step, then anyone who's going back and looking up and seeing where we came from is missing that, because it was done in time and it is not all written down. So careful what we erase. And then again, none of us like repeating ourselves. I think I personally hate repeating myself in any area of my life, but when we can kind of repeat ourselves in multiple modalities, that's really a level of that's going to reduce the need for us to repeat ourselves. When we say something and we write it down, when we say something and we show it, or when we write something down and we sing it even, right? We'll talk about that in the next section for students. When we share this information in multimodalities, it will increase retention. It will reduce the number of times we have to explain something, which again makes our students happier. It makes us happier. So if you take nothing away outside of this, it's that important things should be written down if we speak them. And if we're writing them down, we should also speak them. Okay? So at minimum, for important things, have them in at least 2 modalities. Writing down, speaking, or other things are more creative. So something I think is a little bit more challenging, and that's what we'll do is the next section of this podcast episode, is we should be allowing multiple ways for students to communicate with us and with each other. And I think, again, this is more challenging, but as an example is, let's say that we're in a calculus class, or maybe pre-calculus, and we're talking about increasing functions, then giving them the opportunity to have multiple representations of this one concept. We could ask them to graph a function that's always increasing or increasing on a certain interval. We could ask them to find an equation of that. We could ask them for a written description of what does it mean when something's increasing, or we could ask them to speak that to each other, explain to somebody at your table or at your desk what it means for something to be increasing. We could have them do body motions. What does it mean to be increasing? And maybe they're like going up, or maybe they're tracing a graph with their hand in the air. Again, tying back to pitch is really, really useful. A lot of students can really identify with that musical aspect of learning. We all know that what pitch going up sounds like. So maybe we have a cubic function and we ask students to sing it, and the student is like, oh, and then like the idea of end behavior comes into play, right? Is like, oh, where do we end? Oh, we end really, really high. And you can have a lot of fun with that too. Get students making noises. Can be a little chaotic, but it can be fun. And again, accepting that there are different kinds of students with different sensory processing needs as well. We'll touch on that a little bit later in this episode. But anytime, whether in how we assess students in their grades, or how we engage students in the classroom, anytime we can give them multiple ways of expressing and interacting and engaging with these topics, that's going to help them learn. That's going to help them retain. It's going to help them stay engaged. 'Cause I'll tell you what, most students that I know, their favorite way to be in a class is not to just sit there and listen the whole time. Some might say it is because they just like to be able to like tune out, disassociate, or whatever. But yeah, most of the time, students like to be doing something and interacting with the material in a more active way. Okay, so again, let's go into a couple more examples, get some concrete examples about this. Here's an example for multiple methods of what we can do to increase retention and learning. Again, students sketching their own graphs. Even if you're in an applications-focused class, like I teach a lot of business pre-calc and business calculus, where I don't need students to graph things by hand, even then, having students sketch their own graphs gives a lot of like physical memory of what's going on, similar to how writing with your hand is going to have more retention than taking notes on a laptop. Getting that body involved and that mechanical interaction really helps with that retention. So having students sketch their own graphs is very useful, even if they're graphing with technology, being able to sketch it by hand. You have that physical interaction that I just mentioned. You have to also identify from the graph what is important, right? You're not going to perfectly copy down what you're seeing on the screen. You have to say, okay, where does this start? What's the interesting, there's a turning point here, or here's an intercept, right? Here's the scale of the graph, right? When they sketch that on their own, there's so many skills that they're bringing in addition to just, maybe you care or don't care whether they can graph things by hand. but there's an advantage to students sketching their own graph as an example. In the context of graphs, also, if you print out graphs, having students literally trace them with their hands or doing physical gestures in 3-dimensional space, or maybe 2-dimensional space, and it doesn't matter, but having students actively move their bodies is a good way to just wake up and also get more engagement and retention with some of these things. And again, this is a great thing with end behavior of polynomials, doing the dance I was talking about, or tracing with your hand. And then, as their hand like jumps off the top of the paper or something, right? It's a very noticeable thing that they can remember that can tie into end behavior of polynomials or other functions. Getting students talking around and moving is also a way of multiple modalities. Not everyone can move the same, so you're going to have to be aware of that. Again, we talk about that in a future section of in terms of like equity and accessibility. But whenever possible, getting students talking and moving is very important. We as professors tend to talk too much. Students tend to talk too little, and being able to verbalize and have conversations about math is a really important skill that not everyone's going to have. And I think we've all experienced this as educators, that when we teach something, we really learn so much by teaching. The students, of course, are the same way. When they're talking about it, when they're asking questions to their group members, when they're answering questions from their group members, that's really going to go a long way towards helping them understand and remember this information. I think retention is a very common thing that we struggle with, of like, oh, student may have done this one week, but they just kind of crammed and they didn't retain any of the information. There was nothing deeper there. So getting students talking and moving is a great way for that. You can have them, again, do gestures if you're talking about end behavior, doing physical things with that. Or let's go a little bit more abstract. Maybe you're talking about epsilon delta proofs for limits, or just the epsilon delta idea of a limit. You can have them look at a graph on a whiteboard or something and say, okay, take your hands and squish them together as your x values are getting squished together in this interval, as delta is getting smaller, right? What is happening to those y values? Notice that the range of the y values is also getting squished together. That's kind of your epsilon. It's been a while since I've done that. I may have flipped those, but that is the idea. Getting physically squishing with their hands, horizontally squishing, vertically squishing. That will be very, very useful. And then as a finisher for this little thing on examples for what students can do is, again, group work, participation. That is important for multimodal engagement for our students. There's a lot of other places you can go with allowing students, and this is kind of the last part of UDL that was mentioned earlier, multiple means of them showing their understanding to you. You can go a lot further with this, with incorporating student choice for projects, doing projects at all, having students submit papers, having oral exams, combining all these with traditional assignments. There's so much you can do with this that is really intimidating, to be honest. It's so much work. It does really pay off. But whenever possible, if we can give students that flexibility in how they demonstrate their understanding, it's going to go a long way. And then again, selfishly, one of the advantages is you don't have to hear students complain about just being bad test takers. You'd be like, okay, well, let's do, an oral exam, or let's, have you do a project. Again, as a small tangent, the value of things that students do at home is going down exponentially fast year after year due to AI, I think. But in general, right, giving that flexibility is very important and helps students, and also it does help us. It's a lot of work. I want to do an episode on this later, but I did a huge amount of work last quarter designing a project for my business pre-calculus class that had so much student choice and so much student buy-in as a result, because it was something that they actually got to care about, and there was a lot of structure so they weren't overwhelmed, which is the next section of this episode, cognitive load. But when they're so engaged and they have agency and choice, then it reduces cheating, it makes them work harder, and they learn more and have more fun. So it's everything that we want. It's just also a ton of work. But that's part of the multimodal communication from the student side. Whenever possible, if we can give them multiple ways of communicating their understanding, it's going to be very effective. Okay, two last sections on here. Again, I think we've all been in this from the student side, and many of us have seen this when we are looking at colleagues' classes as well. But there is the worry, the thing that we have to be very careful about when we're talking about multimodal communication is cognitive load. When is more things too many things? If a student has 30 different choices, that's too many choices. That's going to overwhelm most students. If we tell them to do something in 20 different ways, right, that's too many. That can overwhelm students. So how do we strike the balance? And of course, there's also the work-life balance of ourselves. Incorporating this is a lot of work on our own end. So just be aware of this. You're going to have to find the balance. Student feedback is going to go a long way, but just as a warning, right, never give students too much choice. None of us really want as much choice as we say we do sometimes as well. It is important to have options. It is important to have choice. It's important to have examples when you're giving choice, and helping students through that if they're having trouble with those choices. And just err on the side of few choices at the start, and you can always have a provision that allows for more choices on a case-by-case basis. But you don't want to overwhelm your students, and you don't want to overwhelm yourself either. And then again, it's important to have some level of redundancy across modalities like speaking and writing and then showing or singing. Again, right, it's important to have that multiple ways, but we should be making sure that they're reinforcing each other and not splitting the students' attention. For example, like if you're co-teaching a class with another person, or multiple students are doing something on the board at the same time, having one person like say something on one half of the classroom and the other person writing something down on the other half, that can maybe be a lot for students to visually go back and forth between. Even though that I do say that a lot of times we should be writing down what we're speaking, a lot of times if it's in the same area, the same physical space, it's going to be a lot more or reinforcing that attention instead of splitting it. But if we're doing it in the same physical space, or if we're writing something down or talking while we're making a sound or doing a body motion, right? Those are some things that we can do at the same time that really reinforces the concept instead of adding more cognitive load to it. And then also, if we make students do things in too many different ways at the same time, that can be a little overwhelming. And then I think one of the important things, especially from a mathematical perspective, going back to the idea of like, oh yeah, we can have an equation of increasing. We can have a graph of an increasing function. We can have a description of increasing. Make sure to explicitly connect all of these so that students can kind of see the big picture whenever possible. The last thing I want to talk about is the equity piece of all of this. Multimodal communication is going to help everybody in your classroom. Okay? It's going to help by allowing each individual to kind of connect the most strongly where they naturally connect. But there are some bonuses, and one of the bonuses is that multilingual learners are going to benefit significantly from multimodal instruction. If you've ever learned a second language, you know how hard it is sometimes to listen, or maybe you have a hard time reading, but you're good at listening, right? We all have those strengths, and I think that's one of the benefits of learning another language. Is there's so many benefits to learning another language, but one of them is just the knowledge and empathy for people who are learning in our classes. And having the option to see things written down while also hearing it, right, is going to just help all of those multilingual learners so much. And again, I think most of the time it's a pretty small ask of us to be able to incorporate that for them. This also really, really helps a lot of students with disabilities and neurodivergence. They don't need to submit a letter of accommodation for me to say an instruction and write it down. And it's going to help everybody. And so many students, right, like, are going to be distracted by things. So many students have things going on in their brains. So many things, all brains are very, very different from each other. And when we can support with a lot of different options, we don't really shut as many people out. Now, you're never going to be able to do something that works for everybody. But when you have various ways of showing the information, various ways of introducing the information, various ways of reviewing the information, that's going to just let a lot of more people engage with a lot more parts. And then, the warning with that, of course, is, to be flexible. Not all students are going to be able to do all the things that we ask. Just like, so if we have, students like running across the class, or even just sometimes moving around, that can be very difficult for some people. We need to be paying attention to that and being aware. Not everyone has the same fine motor skills if we're asking them to draw really precisely. Some people are very, easily distracted by noise. Some people kind of need to make noise to move things around. So that is, a challenge, and we can take care of that on a case-by-case basis, but we need to be watching. We need to be paying attention so that we can help the students as they show up. Because again, there's no one size fits all. Sometimes allowing one student to fidget and do some like active ways of showing their own learning can be distracting to somebody else who has a hard time concentrating with distractions. And so you're never going to be able to make everyone happy. You're never going to be able to help everyone in the same way. We just have to kind of watch and take care of situations as they arise. So again, doing multimodal communication from an instructor side and allowing it from the student side is really going to help multilingual learners and students with disability and neurodivergent students as well. So it's an extra bonus to something that helps everybody. We'll close there. I want you to, my little challenge to you in the 2 weeks until the next episode is I want you to pick one thing from this episode to kind of incorporate into your class over the next 2 weeks, or if you're on break, thinking about what can you incorporate into the next quarter or semester that you start. Now, maybe that's paying attention to what you're erasing in the middle of a problem. Maybe that's you paying attention to writing down instructions instead of just only giving them verbally, or maybe talking through instructions that are already written down. Maybe that's giving students options for how they show understanding. Anything, right? Pick one thing. Don't overwhelm yourself. Don't try to do too many things. Don't try to incorporate student choice with 30 different assignments. Don't overhaul your class based on this episode, but pick one thing. And then also, I'd love to hear any feedback you have about this show. And you can check the description for my contact information. Love to hear what you think. I'd love to hear any ideas for things you'd like to hear about as well, or any guests you would like to have on the show, and would really appreciate it. So you can also leave a rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. And that's pretty much it. I'm Jason Barnett. Thank you for hanging out with me, and hope you had a good time. Until next time, bye-bye.